Okay, let's turn to the Sophists and figure out what they said and why they're important. The Sophists lived about 2,500 years ago in the 400s BCE, and it's helpful to think of them as transitional philosophers from the pre-Socratics to Socrates. But I think it's also important to remember that their relativism and skepticism and so on are just as relevant today as they were in ancient times. So we'll come back to that later. And although there is no sophistic school and no two sophists thought exactly alike, we can still find some common themes in sophism, especially when we compare them and contrast them with Socratic and Platonic thought. So let's start with some basic facts about these sophists. The sophists were paid teachers who traveled the ancient world, and because of their travels, their knowledge was more likely to be inductive, to be worldly, and to be encyclopedic. So, for example, Protagoras was very familiar with the ethical beliefs and practices of other cultures, and that probably contributed to his relativism. Another common feature of the sophists is that they turned inward to examine the human. They looked at the human subject, human cultures, the human mind, and this is quite different from the outward and metaphysical focus of the pre-Socratics. And remember, the pre-Socratics were searching for the objective foundations of reality, whether it be water or air or what have you. So we could say that the sophists looked into a mirror, metaphorically, whereas the pre-Socratics looked out at the world with metaphorical telescopes and microscopes. So the final thing about the sophists I want to mention is that people really respected the sophists at the time. They elected them to represent them, and they paid sophists to teach them logic and poetry and math and rhetoric and other subjects. However, Socrates, Plato, and other later philosophers would portray them in a negative light for reasons we'll explore in a minute. Indeed, they were so successful in portraying them in a negative light that the sophistry, that the word sophistry, it now refers to people who use superficial and deceptive arguments to persuade other people, or rather to manipulate them even. So sophistry now has sort of a bad name. Okay. All right, so let's look at the themes of Stoicism. Most sophists, or many of them at least, were relativists, subjectivists, skeptics, and practical people who taught rhetoric. And let's take a look at each of these themes. First, most of them were relativists, and relativism is the belief that there is no objective truth. Now, there's also something called ethical relativism, which is the belief that there's no objective truth in ethics. So there's at least two types here, and they were both types. Now, perhaps the sophists were relativists because the pre-Socratic search for truth failed to find a final answer, or maybe because the sophists traveled so much it increased their awareness of the variety of ethical beliefs among varying cultures. Whatever the case, we'll examine Protagoras' arguments for relativism in just a moment, but for now it's enough to observe that most sophists were relativists, whereas Socrates and Plato were non-relativists. Socrates and Plato were objectivists. The second theme here is that many of the relativists were skeptics, many of the sophists were skeptics, where skepticism is the idea that we cannot or do not know. Again, Socrates and Plato, while very aware of the limits of knowledge, believed that we could know some things. That is, Socrates and Plato did not share the level of skepticism that the sophists had. Even Socrates, the idea of Socratic wisdom is knowing that you don't know, but such an insight spurred Socrates on to find knowledge, and such an insight implies that we have a standard of knowledge. And also, Socratic wisdom implies that we know what some things aren't, even if we don't know what they are. So in short, Socrates and Plato didn't share the level of skepticism that the sophists seem to have maintained. The third theme is that the sophists were practical and expedient teachers. After all, it's really futile to study logic in order to know objective truth if there is no objective truth, or if we cannot know. That is, if it's futile to study logic for those reasons if relativism or skepticism are true. So one consequence of sophistic ideas is that we shouldn't learn logic to discover objective truth. Rather, we should learn rhetoric to persuade others, to get what we want, to win lawsuits, to persuade people to vote for us, and so on. That is, rhetoric should replace logic. So one position of many sophists is that rhetoric should replace logic. In a world without objective truth, as many sophists maintain, we should do what works, what's expedient. We shouldn't really worry too much about what's right or true, since there is no objective right or objective truth. Now, there's variation among the sophists there, but overall, with that position, Socrates would, of course, later disagree with that position in very interesting ways. So with that in mind, let's look at some individual sophists. The most famous sophist was Protagoras, and he said man is the measure of all things, which seems to support a type of individual relativism. So to better understand his statement, consider my version of one of his arguments. He says, imagine that I'm in a hot room, and I then exit and immerse my feet in a bath that I perceive as cold. Now, imagine that you're in a cold room, and you then exit and immerse your feet in the same bath that you perceive as warm, right? So that is, the water is warm to your sense organs, and it's cold to my sense organs. So water is both hot and cold because the temperature, in this case, is relative to each of us, to each person. So based on this example, Protagoras seems correct. Man is a measure of all things. There is no objective hot or cold, since hot and cold is relative to each person. It's measured subjectively and relatively by each person. However, Socrates and Plato would disagree. Socrates and Plato argued that it's not all relative. So for example, we can discover that the interior angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. And if I say they add up to 400 degrees, I'm wrong, and you can prove it. Indeed, we discover this truth. We don't invent it. Therefore, it's not all relative. This is kind of how, in some cases, Socrates and Plato would argue against relativism. And of course, this means that relativism is the idea that all beliefs are relative, and Socrates and Plato are countering that. So in another video called Do We Create All Truth, I outline other arguments against relativism, many of which come from Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And these arguments consist of appeals to objective logic, to objective science, to objective math, and to introspective states. And they appeal to all of these to show that it's not all relative. Now, of course, Protagoras and the other sophists were loved and respected at the time, and they probably had deeper arguments than we now have records of. But it's also true that Socrates and Plato later argued that these sophists didn't go deep enough and simply didn't understand or appreciate the logical consequences of their relativism and subjectivism and so on, and skepticism. So, according to Socrates, we can eliminate bad answers and get closer to the truth even in fields like ethics. And this is done by applying the Socratic method to questions like, what is justice? And you can see my video on the Socratic method if you want to learn more about that. So Protagoras, again, was very interesting, very famous, and he was a very conservative type of sophist. Even though he believed that man is a measure of all things, he thought you should, follow your culture, your city's religion, and your city or culture's laws, because after all, it's all relative, so why not follow them and obey them? Okay. So kind of a conservative relativist. Anyway, another sophist was Gorgias, and I like to call him Gorgias. Anyway, Gorgias was very skeptical about our ability to know and wanted to replace logic with rhetoric. One of Gorgias's arguments involved proving that there is nothing. Right? So now, you'll probably think this is absurd, and you're right, because there's obviously something. After all, you're currently reading or listening to this, so there's obviously something. But Gorgias' point is that if we can logically prove such an absurd proposition like there is nothing, then we can prove anything using logic. It's kind of like Zeno's old paradox of motion. So, indeed, you could even say, why not prove that all is one and unchanging like Parmenides, right? So in a way, Gorgias is making fun of Parmenides, if you think about it. But Gorgias, he was certainly brilliant. He was a brilliant poet, a speaker, and he enjoyed trying to prove these absurdities. He argued that reason cannot give us knowledge, so stop trying, at least not objective knowledge, so stop trying to reason to objective truth. It's just impossible. He also, interestingly, argued that even if you knew the truth, you wouldn't be able to communicate it. So maybe it's kind of like this. It's like trying to explain what the color red is to a blind person. You'll never really convey the truths that must be experienced. If I say red is like a big loud boom noise, that person still doesn't know what red is, right? Words limit us. Language limits us. And so, in short, logic and speaking aren't about getting at objective truth. They're about rhetoric, about self-expression, about poetry, about persuasion. And that's what we should keep in mind, says Gorgias. Now, in Plato's book called the Gorgias, Plato responds to Gorgias by distinguishing philosophy from rhetoric. Right? He distinguishes the two. And Aristotle, too, argues that Gorgias and other slick-talking orators are people who work to appear wise, but their real goal is to make money and win approval by using misleading or sophistic arguments. Now, I wish we had more of Protagoras and Gorgias' arguments and writings, but as it stands, I believe Plato and Aristotle, in books like the Gorgias and the Republic and so on, they present very strong criticisms of the Sophists, and they do an excellent job of defending epistemological and ontological objectivism in the face of this relativism and skepticism. Now, two other representative Sophists were Thrasymachus and Callicles. They represented a type of blatant cynicism towards ethics, religion, self-control even. So Thrasymachus argued that might makes right. And Callicles, like Nietzsche, argued that morality and ethics is just a way for the weak to control the strong. They believe that everyone is struggling for power and everyone's trying to satisfy their desires and achieve pleasure. So according to these Sophists, there is nothing more to life than this. Even Callicles, I believe it was, said that religion was a hoax, that we should teach people to fear the gods so we can easily manipulate them. Okay, so even though God doesn't exist, don't teach people that. Let's teach them God does exist so we can manipulate them and keep them in a state of fear. So obviously these sorts of statements contributed to the negative image of the sophist. And again, the genius of Socrates and Plato disagreed with them and responded to these views in many works. And the most notable is probably Plato's Republic. So what's the application and value here? First of all, keep in mind that most sophists were good people who played an important role in the ancient world. They educated people, they supported pan-Hellenic attempts, and they took the important step of turning inward to study the lens through which we see the world, to study the subject and not just the object. However, their ideas seem to support destructive and simply false forms of relativism, subjectivism, skepticism, and expediency. And because of this, Socrates and Plato responded by showing that it's not all relative. There is an objective foundation for true knowledge, and even, I would say, and they would say, ethical judgments. Now, what's really interesting is that this debate is still with us today, especially in ethics, but also in other areas. So modern sophists are called ethical relativists, and modern defenders of Plato's views are called ethical objectivists. In other areas, modern sophists are called postmoderns or post-structuralists, while those who disagree with them are closer to Plato's position. So this debate has continued for 2,400 years and will continue. But it's worth studying. So even if you study, the history of this debate, you'll find that there is a type of progress at work here in philosophy. So, for example, we know the major arguments on both sides now, and we can identify the weaker and stronger forms of relativism and objectivism. Right? We can make, even if it's a negative form of progress, we can make some form of progress. So standing on the shoulders of these giants, we can make more informed decisions. So that's the sophist. There's a couple of exercise questions here. The second one is to create a grid comparing the pre-Socratic sophists and Socrates and Plato. This grid should compare and contrast them. So, for example, the pre-Socratics focus on the external world, whereas the sophists and Socrates and Plato would turn inward as well and focus on things like ethics and how the lens through which we see the world. The pre-Socratics and Socrates and Plato are closer to objectivism, whereas the Socrates and Plato have a more sophisticated form of objectivism, whereas the sophists are in general relativists and subjectivists. So go ahead and complete that matrix and see how many qualities you can compare and contrast.